Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started. The beginning of this story takes place 3 months before the main thread of events. Everyone had gathered at a ball in the Western Empire and was just happy. Lots of masked people fighting. Because it was a masquerade ball, they were having fun, talking among themselves and even dancing. Well, here was this girl, who was in a completely different form, standing outside the windows of this hall and hiding from people. She felt a severe pain in her stomach. But still she stood on the ledge of the second floor and was afraid to even look down. There was also a guard not far from her. The girl could not understand why the banquet in the royal palace was made on this day, and it upset her very much. Even just last night she'd drunk so much raw that she'd forgotten this banquet even existed. And right now, more than anything, she wished she could just walk away and not be touched. But in the morning she was scolded by her mother, saying that if she was not at the ball, she would be finished. And the girl took this threat seriously, for she knew that she had better not joke with her mother. It was Lady Arnie, and she was still standing outside the windows, thinking about the fact that she needed to at least show herself to the Emperor, and after that she could go and get a hangover. Well, at that moment the girl suddenly heard two ladies talking who were standing nearby. One of them asked, "Didn't Lady Arnie come again?" The other girl replied that the Duchess had already looked for her and was very angry, because this girl had promised to be there, and she had not even shown up, had not even said hello to anyone. The girl suddenly laughed and asked how it could be so. Their Arnie would be in big trouble now. Arnie herself at that moment imagined herself on a horse, flying straight home to make herself feel better. The girl felt sick, because she realized that if she met her mother now, she would order an express carriage straight to hell. But Arnie had a different problem now. She needed to meet the Emperor discreetly, and then tell him to ask the girl. Walking farther and farther along the ledge, trying to be inconspicuous so that the guests in the hall wouldn't really see her, and ask even more questions. When she got to the very edge, she looked to the side and saw the rest of the castle, thinking that it must be on the third floor like always. She accelerated and, jumping across the space, was able to grab the handle of the balcony. The girl was in excellent physical shape, so it was not difficult for her. Arnie easily jumped over the railing and was already on the veranda itself when she looked forward and suddenly saw the silhouette of a man and was very surprised, because she thought that no one would be in this place. The stranger also heard some strange sounds behind him. He immediately turned around and was very surprised to see the girl. The man had incredibly beautiful and bright blue eyes. However, his face was also covered by a mask, for he was also present at the ball. But Arnie, when she looked at him, didn't realize who he was, what kind of stranger he was in the first place. The girl was still sitting on the ground, and they looked at each other, not realizing how they had ended up in this place in the first place, or why they had met in the first place. But suddenly Arnie realized that she couldn't be apart right now, so she was about to get up. The man came closer to her to help her up, but she, when she saw it, was able to jump aside very quickly, so he didn't even have time to realize anything. At the same moment, two guards came out to him. They addressed him as His Highness and asked if everything was all right, for they had heard some strange sounds. The guy immediately waved them aside and said that everything was fine here, and nothing like that had happened, so they could go back to their seats. When those guards left, he began to smile sweetly, remembering and then the stranger he saw, and thought about how she was just a stray kitty who was apparently looking for a place to sleep. Arnie, for her part, was already on the other side of the castle and looked out the window and saw that there was no one in the corridor, so she could safely enter it. The girl was still worried about that stranger for a while, but then she realized that it had nothing to do with her anyway, so there was no point in worrying about it. When the girl jumped through the window, she was able to climb into the castle, but she felt so bad that she could barely stay on her feet. Everything was cramping up inside her. Soon after, Arnie opened the doors and saw many guests who were dressed very nicely. They were dancing and talking among themselves. She walked a little closer and looked down and saw something strange. It was someone's unwanted mask, and it was just lying on the floor. Of course, no one said that it is not necessary, but the girl decided to take it after all, in order not to be immediately revealed, and plus this dress code of the event. Soon afterwards, one of the guests came to the place where she had left the mask and was surprised to see that it had disappeared. Arnie, in turn, began to move away from the place so that the lady would not see her. Arnie walked forward and saw a pandemonium of guests who began to worship one of the men. She stopped and saw that it was the emperor of the Western state. It's also her personal superior. His name is Sikleon IV. He's also the girl's uncle. At this point, she thought that everything was going great so far. She just needed to get up and show herself to him soon. After that, she could leave. But at that moment, she saw the guests in front of her, who approached each other. One of the girls in a bright red dress approached the other and addressed her by name Milan, saying that they had not seen each other for a long time. This girl was Rosalie Brillhart. She was Brillhart's wife and also Arnie's mother. Rosalia smiled sweetly, but then asked the girl if by any chance she had seen her daughter, because she said she would kill her if this girl didn't come to the event. Boyfriend, when she saw her mom, was just horrified. She realized that she had to run away as soon as possible, so she went to the exit, thinking that she should in no way meet her. The girl in turn replied to Rosalie that this place was a masquerade and everyone wore masks, so that was probably the reason why she couldn't find her daughter. The woman suddenly laughed and said that there was simply no such thing. After all, she doesn't even know that this event is a masquerade. The boy, who had run off into the corridor, suddenly turned around and saw that her mother and the stranger were following her. The girl was incredibly angry and didn't understand why everything had coincided at this exact moment. She saw the passage, and so she quickly turned the corner before her mother saw her. Rosalia sighed heavily and, turning to herself, asked what this girl was thinking. How could she not come to such an important event, and when her own mother said to do it? Arnie herself was hiding around the corner, her body shaking all over. She hoped her mother would just walk on by and not even look in her direction. Rosalia herself turned to look in that direction. The girl, seeing her frightened face, immediately asked the Duchess, "What happened?" She had a really strange expression on her face. The girl stood for a while, and afterwards she said she thought she should look at something, for she had a strange presentiment. Arnie was incredibly scared at this point. She even closed her eyes and wasn't about to watch herself being slowly killed if her mother noticed her. But at that moment, she suddenly heard a man's voice say that his stray cat was here after all. He threw his cloak over her shoulder and covered her. Arnie immediately opened her eyes, and when she saw the man, she recognized him immediately, for he was the stranger she had met on the balcony. The girl was incredibly surprised. She looked at him without taking her eyes off and asked, "Is this really the same man she saw the other day?" However, the stranger only smiled and put a finger to her mouth, showing her to be quiet, for she didn't want her mother to notice. Rosalia, who was getting closer and closer, saw a man with a girl. She immediately stopped, and apologizing, said that she didn't know anyone was here. The guy himself, continuing to cover the army, said that there was nothing wrong with it, but the woman was not going to back down and asked why they were suddenly standing there. The man replied that his partner was just very shy, so they decided to move away from all the commotion. Rosalia stepped aside and immediately laughed, saying that she understood everything now and wished them a pleasant evening. She turned to Milan and said they could go, for she had mistaken her identity. The woman was determined to find her daughter after all. When they had moved far enough away, the man pulled his cloak away from Arnie, and the girl was relieved she could finally exhale. She remembered the words he had said to her mother, and did not understand why he was suddenly helping her. So she turned and walked closer to him, intending to find out who he was. The man in her line kept smiling and asked if she had finally found what she wanted. Arnie looked at him in surprise, not sure what he meant. The stranger was confused, and he said he thought she had come to this place uninvited. Arnie sighed heavily and thought about how she didn't want to explain everything to him more than anything. But she had no choice. She decided to change the subject and wondered why he let her stay if he knew she didn't have an invitation. The man smiled even wider and said he just thought it was really funny, so he decided to play along. Arnie continued to stare at him, while she herself didn't realize who he even was. The fact that he didn't know her meant that he was probably a foreigner. They stood silent for a while, And then the man said that they would probably stop at the version that he was just interested in a stray cat. The girl looked at him indignantly, not understanding why he was calling her a stray cat. And then she assumed that it was probably because she was climbing up the railing like some cute and furry animal. The man, as he looked at her, directly pictured her with her beautiful big ears and naughty tail. Then he smiled. It was a very pleasant sight, after all. Arnie was starting to get really annoyed by this. She turned away, not understanding why this was happening at this moment. After all, she was already very nauseous. She ran away, thinking that she'd have to deal with him later. Out of her last strength, she held back her vomit and thanked the man for his help, saying she would be sure to thank him next time. Arnie took out her badge and, putting it in the man's hand, told him to take it. She then turned around and started to run away. She told the stranger that it was time for her to run. The man stayed where he was, smiling stupidly as he watched her disappear into the distance. Shortly thereafter, a young man approached him and addressed him as Mr. Cassian. He saw a token in the man's hands and immediately asked what it was. Cassian continued to smile and looked at the token and said that he didn't even know himself. And afterwards he added that it was a special token of gratitude from the cat, his assistant, who continued to stand. He was very surprised, not understanding what had happened to him, for he had not been in such a good mood for a long time. Then Cassian inquired what business the boy had come to him with. He answered that the emperor had summoned him to him, and when the man heard this, his good mood vanished like a hand. His voice became very rough and his gaze serious, and he told the aide that in that case they should go. In fact, compared to the Northern Empire, everything looked very expensive and rich in this place. And it was only possible because of one person, namely because of the sword master who defends this beautiful and prosperous empire every day. There were only 100 people in history who could obtain the status of this very sword master, and among them were most from the Western Empire. They always saved her from destruction and collapse, from all the barbarians who wanted to step with their dirty feet on their beautiful and sacred land. And Cassian thought to himself that since he was already in this place, who would he want to see this illustrious swordmaster in person? So when the man came to the emperor, he told him of his request. He laughed and asked if he really wanted to meet the swordmaster. He thought for a while, and then said that this guy wouldn't even show his nose even if he was summoned by the emperor himself, so it was almost impossible to do so. Cassian continued to drink his tea and was very surprised that this man could afford to disobey imperial orders, and he didn't even get any punishment for it. The emperor also said that he couldn't brag about it, but it was a trait in him after all. At that moment, the man himself thought that if rumors of Arnie being a swordmaster spread in other states, her mother would just strangle him because her daughter wouldn't be able to marry properly. After all, no one would want to marry a swordmaster, so a man must keep this secret a secret until the very last moment. Cassian was very disappointed when he heard the rejection. He turned in the other direction and sighed heavily, suddenly seeing some people leaving the manor. It was just his stray kitty. She was being led by the ear by her mom and told that she was just a nasty girl who couldn't even spend one evening in peace. When the man saw her, he immediately smiled, because after all, she hadn't managed to escape and had been caught. The emperor didn't understand where this guy was looking, so he turned to him and suggested that he'd rather talk about the wedding, and asked if he had already found the girl he wanted. In fact, the emperor had arranged this ball so that Cassian could find a bride to unite the western and northern parts of the empire. It would be much easier to commiserate that way. Sicilian looked carefully at the man and said he could speak plainly, no need to be shy. Whoever she was, he would understand. Cassian continued talking as if nothing had happened. He sipped his tea again and said that he didn't even know. The man thought about the fact that the main thing was that the conditions should match. But if it was to be the case, he wanted it to be some interesting person. He immediately remembered the girl who had thanked him for his help. He suddenly laughed and thought about the fact that she said she could also help him next time. The man put the gold token on the table and said that he was choosing her. The emperor, when he saw this token, was simply horrified, for he realized that it belonged just to Arnie. Cassian looked at the man and smiled, and said that he definitely wanted to marry her. In fact, Arnie in the Western Empire was right at the pinnacle of her military power, and she was considered a heroine among the people. Everyone looked at her with admiration. She was the leader of the Golden Dragon Knights and could easily deal with any kind of monster. She was a master swordsman, looked up to. But her mother kept wishing she would finally marry already and be settled. Despite all the achievements of the girl, Arnie at home was just a daughter who cannot find for herself a good-looking and rich husband, so it directly killed her morally. And so the morning after the ball, her mother came to her again and began to give her some educational talks. And Arnie in turn watched her and saw the window there. The girl thought about jumping into it safely, but her mother kept shouting and asked if she knew Ariel, who had already married an earl from a neighboring state. She enthusiastically said that all her peers are already married ladies and are living happily ever after, because love is a beautiful feeling that everyone should experience. Arnie looked at her mom indignantly and thought about how she might as well pay attention to her love instead of prying into her daughter's affairs. They were both silent for a while. Then the mother asked her daughter if she even knew what she was called. Arnie liked that question and asked if everyone called her Swordmaster, but her mother waved her head in denial. Then the girl said she was probably a heroine, but the woman said she was wrong too. Then Arnie thought about it and said that she must have been called a mad dog by everyone. Rosalia began to shout and said that everyone called her not just a mad dog, but the mad dog of the whole empire. The girl was very pleased with herself, for she had guessed her role after all. In fact, as soon as there was talk of a wedding, everyone started throwing fits, remembering how they'd almost died from her beatings. But Arnie didn't care. She just sighed and said they'd been weak. Her mother couldn't stand the bickering, so she slapped her daughter. She turned around and sighed heavily. Arnie held back her emotions because she could have hit back even harder, but of course she had no right to raise her hand against her mother. The girl considered it a stab in the back from her mother. The Swordmaster woman was very tired and sat down in a chair, saying that she really wanted her favorite daughter to be loved by a man as well. Arnie looked at her mother in surprise and asked if it was really about a woman's happiness. But Rosalia said that everyone feels happiness differently, and if for her happiness is to live such a life, then it is necessary to continue to live like that. It's just not to her liking that she does not even seek romantic relationships. Arnie, even that one word, romance, annoyed her, so she rolled her eyes and didn't understand why this romantic relationship was so important to her mom. Rosalia decided to go a little off topic and said that the emperor himself was concerned about her marriage, so he had chosen a suitable match for her. The girl, when she heard about it, was very angry. She didn't understand if he had really done it. She wondered who he had decided to choose. Rosalia replied that the man was the Archduke of Terneuzen from the Northern Empire. He is rumored to be the #1 groom in their homeland. But Arnie's mere word that he was from the Northern Empire was already irritating. She said it was a different state, and wondered if she wanted to marry a foreigner. Her mom said it's just like she said. No one in this state wants to marry her, so there is only hope for people like him. But Arnie protested and said she didn't want it that way, and wondered why she should date a man she didn't even know by sight. But Rosalia insisted and said that if she didn't use such cruel methods, her daughter would never meet anyone, so she had no choice. Her mother said that first she would just get to know him, and then she would know whether she liked him or not. In addition, many people say that he is incredibly handsome, because she herself wanted her husband to be handsome. Arnie was ready to explode with her anger and told her mom to stop already, because she wasn't going to date anyone. No matter who it was, there was no way she was going to marry him. But 3 days had passed since their conversation, and her mother still kept reminding her that he was a very good option for her. And even after a week, she was saying that he was on the same level as her, and not bad in his own right. And even after 2 weeks, her mom still insisted and said it was her last request. Arnie, who couldn't even sleep, said she would see him after all, only asking that her mom stop talking about it every day. And soon, the day of their meeting finally arrived. Arnie was still worried that she was going to be married to a foreigner, and after the wedding she would probably have to go abroad. And she didn't understand why she had to do it at all, for she had lived perfectly well so far without any weddings or husbands. For a girl, freedom is much more important than the obligations of marriage. However, if she refuses now, her mother will not even listen to her. When the girl dressed for this meeting, she looked at her and said that this was her most beautiful daughter on earth. Arnie's only option was to agree and just go to the meeting. His mother said, smiling, that they should go slowly, or else Hertz would be waiting, and it would be rude of them to do so. She thought about what she'd have to do just to get him to reject her on his own, and she'd turn the whole thing upside down, and it would be an encounter he'd remember forever. The place of their meeting was one of the halls of the Imperial Palace, so it was not long before Arnie and his mother finally got there. The maid immediately ushered them into a special room and told them that they could settle down in the form of the Archduke until he arrived. Arnie, when she saw that her mother was staying, asked if she was really going to go to this meeting together. Rosalia said that of course she was, for her father and the Emperor were coming soon, and everyone should be present. The girl sighed heavily and thought about the fact that if she made a scandal in front of everyone, it would be tantamount to suicide, so her plan would have to be postponed. Her mother stopped the maid and started talking to her about the interior. The maid said that everything in this place was done according to His Majesty's taste, so it was quite beautiful. But Arnie thought about the fact that, despite all these difficulties she had encountered, she still had some way to go. She stealthily went to the window and stood there for a while. The girl quickly opened it and jumped down, thinking that she should just disappear unnoticed before it was too late. The mother, who was very much surprised at the conversation, suddenly looked away and saw that her daughter was as good as gone. She saw the open window and started wondering if she had jumped out there. But when she realized, she was so angry that she even broke her fan she was holding. Arnie, in turn, landed on the ground and looked around for a while, not knowing what she should do now. But suddenly she saw a wagon standing nearby. The girl was immediately happy and thought she was incredibly lucky. Arnie immediately started running that way and motioned for them to stop. She thought about the fact that she just needed to avoid this place for a while. But the moment she opened the carriage, she was very surprised, for it was Cassian who sat inside. There was an awkward silence between them, and they looked at each other in surprise. No one had expected to see each other. The man came to his senses first, smiled, and turning to the girl, said that here they were meeting again, calling her a stray kitty. Arnie froze in surprise and asked if he was the man. He just waved his head and kept smiling. Then they heard the cries of the Emperor and her mother, who finally saw the girl. Arnie knew she had to act quickly, so she immediately climbed into the carriage and closed the doors behind her. Cassian, watching this whole scene, covered his mouth with his hand to keep from laughing, for this situation was really comical. The girl sighed heavily and apologized, saying she just asked that he take her somewhere as soon as possible. The man just sat back and said that at this point she looked very much like a lady trying to avoid a marriage of convenience. Arnie was skeptical of this statement and just looked at him. Then the man said that if she needed help, she could go to him. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised. She didn't understand what kind of man in his right mind would say it was okay to use him, and she didn't understand why he was so eager to help her all the time. She didn't know if he even knew who she was. Maybe he was some kind of crook and wanted a reward for his help, and that would explain it. Seeing her wary face, Cassian smiled and said she had nothing to worry about. He didn't need anything from her. The girl suddenly realized that she must have had that question directly reflected on her face, so she made a simpler appearance and thought he was just being cocky. The most important thing now was that he really helped her. So Arnie cleared her throat and said that in that case, since he said she could use it, the man interrupted her and said he was happy to help her. Then she wants him to pretend to be her lover, just for this day. The girl was very happy to have such an ingenious idea in her head. Cassian in turn smiled happily and bowed, saying that he would gladly honor the request. Soon after, the carriage went straight into town and drove farther and farther away. The girl looked out the window and wondered where they were going. The man replied, as if nothing had happened, that he was going on a date. When Arnie heard this, she looked at him in surprise and asked him if he was really going on a date. But Cassian kept smiling and said that she had asked him to be her lover after all, so this should be seen by as many people as possible for everyone to believe it. Arnie thought about it and thought that it certainly scared her a little, but she thought it made sense. The man in turn explained that if a lot of people saw it, the rumors spreading about it would be heard by her relatives, so they would cancel the wedding. When she heard about it, she said it was brilliant. She realized it was to break the marriage contract, Soon the carriage stopped and the man, smiling, said that they had arrived so they could get out now. When they went outside, they immediately saw a small cafe that was surrounded by various flowers. Cassian immediately ordered one popular dessert that looked very beautiful and spectacular. The girl began to scrutinize his appearance, for she was more familiar with the battlefield than with various desserts. The man in turn noticed that the girls behind them had started discussing Lady Arnie, and they couldn't believe it was really her. Many people present did not realize who the man beside her was. They assumed he was her lover and said he was handsome. They decided that there was simply no such thing, so they wanted to ask him to introduce him to them. The man was immediately wary when he heard it, and Arnie, who had suspected nothing, started tasting the desserts and said it was incredibly delicious. Then Cassian reached forward and asked her if she wanted him to show her the quickest way to start rumors of a crush. The girl, who was a little groggy, immediately looked at him in surprise, not sure what he was even talking about. Well, the man did not think long, reached out his hand and began to wipe her face with gentle movements. After that piece of cream that was on her face, he himself tasted. And Cassian, smiling, said that it was really very tasty and no wonder it was talked about so much. The people present, when they saw this gesture, immediately started looking at them and whispering. Then the man smiled and said that this was the fastest way to let rumors of a crush fly. Arnie, who still couldn't get over what had happened, thought to herself that he must have lost his mind. She quickly began to wipe the spot where he had touched her hand, for it was very disgusting and strange. A few more hours had passed since then. They finished sitting in the cafe, and the man gave her a ride home. She thanked him for the day, and Cassian bowed and said it was very good that he had been able to help her. Arnie continued to smile and thought about how she'd always thought dating was something complicated, but it ended up being quite interesting. And most importantly, it was beneficial to her. After all, if word got out that she was with another man, her mother would change her mind before the wedding, so she, smiling again, thanked him for his help and said she would be sure to thank him later. She was just glad that now she wouldn't have any unplanned wedding with a stranger. Cassian kept smiling and said that she already owed him a lot. The girl felt a little uncomfortable at those words, but she didn't react. Then the man looked at her in surprise and asked if she really didn't want to get married so badly, since she hadn't seen a suitor yet, not even as a spouse. Arnie sighed heavily and said that she was just giving in to her parents' whims. But the most important thing was that it was the Duke of the Northern Empire. She thought that with such a lofty title, he could have been married long ago, but she had never even met anyone. Immediately after her mother had given her the news, she had asked her sister for advice. The sister, listening to her carefully, smiled and said that since he had never had a girlfriend yet, he had some faults. And if there are no flaws, then there is a mistress. These are two indispensable factors. Arnie tells the man that she doesn't think a normal man in his right mind would agree to marry her, and she doesn't want to live in a foreign country with a foreigner. She wants to stay in her home country. She had never understood why one traveled so far away to supposedly be happy. She was fine here, with her title and her adventures. Cassian, for his part, was very surprised, but he did not show it. It was the first time in his life that he had ever seen such an attitude to his person. After saying goodbye to her, he said that he hoped her wishes would one day come true. After that, they went their separate ways. In fact, such rumors about Arnie having a fabulously handsome suitor spread instantly, and it was even reported in the newspaper. When the emperor read the morning papers, he was very surprised. So Arnie thought that the matter of her marriage would be postponed. The next day, however, when her mother heard of it, she came to her at once. Rosalia said she appreciated her courage to dare to meet another man on the day she met her future husband. But if she loved him, she could marry him. Even a secret lover, she wouldn't mind. When Arnie heard this, she didn't even have anything to say to her mother. She hadn't expected her to suggest such an option. Her mother in turn smiled and said that the Duke had been very generous. He said he didn't care much for her scandals and intrigues. Rosalia smiled again and said that her mommy wasn't expecting anything grand. Anyone was fine for her, as long as she got married and was really happy with a man. The girl, hearing this, was simply furious. She couldn't believe that even this method didn't work. Then she thought that all she had to do was to keep going. So Arnie screamed with all her might and said that she really didn't want to marry anyone. When her mother heard the cry, she was very surprised. She said nothing, but sat back in her chair. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said something about 3 months. Arnie couldn't hear and asked her what she was saying. Rosalia told her to live only 3 months married, and if she didn't like it, that she could get a divorce and go back home. Arnie was very surprised to hear this, and asked if her mother would really let her get a divorce. But Rosalia, in her turn, said that she would have to live a humble life without showing her temper, and if even after 3 months she was against marriage, her mother would no longer bother her with this talk. Arnie, when she heard this suggestion, pondered for a while, but then realized that she could still be patient, and the end result would be worth it. So she waved her head in agreement. However, the mother also said that another condition would be that the husband must not be killed or beaten, and that he must not be planted in any way. Arnie laughed suddenly and said she wasn't sure she could handle such a heavy condition, but she understood. The girl herself at that moment thought that if she got tired of it all, she could just kill her husband and go back home. Eventually, after some more discussion, they finally agreed with their mother that Arnie would marry, and the news of the impending wedding stirred the entire Western Empire. They were incredibly surprised that a girl like her would already be married. Soon afterward, many knights came to the emperor, and they bowed and said that if Lady Arnie went to another state, it would be a great loss to the army. The men were very indignant, and didn't understand what His Highness was even thinking. After all, they might not even be able to do it themselves. However, the emperor smiled and said that Arnie would be given the status of a princess, and she would be treated with special respect in the Western Empire. He enthusiastically turned to his niece and said that she was the future of the Western Empire. Therefore, all hope is in her, Arnie. When she heard those words, she didn't even feel comfortable, and she thought about how her uncle had gone a little overboard after all. By that very time, rumors also spread in the Northern Empire that the Archduke from Terneuzeln was getting married. Many ladies were incredibly surprised and others in turn upset, but they weren't sure who he was marrying. In fact, the son of a former emperor and second on the list of pretenders to the throne, the first person in high society to want to marry, unless you count the crown prince, that was exactly the person Cassian was. And to take the place of his wife is the dream of all socialites. But now this place has simply disappeared from under their noses. Thus began a huge change in the Northern Empire. However, the perpetrator of these events, the man himself, remained absolutely calm. His assistant, who was always in the center of events, immediately retold him all the latest gossip. Cassian, when he had finished, asked if there had been any other conversation. He replied that the ladies had not talked about anything else. The man sighed heavily, but didn't reply anything to that. He thought again about the occasion when he had spoken of marriage and shown the emperor the token. He couldn't believe that it had just seemed to him last time that Sicilian IV had somehow reacted strangely to the news. The man was silent for a while longer. He tapped his quill on the table in thought. Cassian then turned to the assistant again and asked what detail was in question that was keeping him in suspense. The man thought there was something unclean about the situation after all, and it alarmed him. The aide said that some people talk about Duke Brilhard's heir being very troubled. Cassian looked at him in surprise and asked in what sense a problematic guy. The aide explained that he was even called the mad dog of the empire, and because of that it was very difficult to get information about Duke Brilhart. Cassian leaned over the back of his chair and said that he was now very curious as to why he was so nicknamed in the community. The aide said that many rumors say he hits everyone if you say even an extra word he might not like. When Cassian heard this, he sighed heavily and thought about how Arnie could be a family member next to such an aggressive person. But then he thought that perhaps that was the reason she had grown up so malleable. He remembered what the girl looked like and thought it was all very funny. But then, suddenly the assistant said that the airship would be arriving very soon and he had to get ready. For a while the man continued to sit in his chair and smile stupidly. And then he stood up and said they could go. Cassian thought about the fact that when he met her again, she would probably have a funny look on her face, because she had no idea who her fiancé would be then. But Lady Arnie was already seated and awaiting her fate, which she had willingly accepted. A maid came running out and told her that the airship was about to land, so she should hurry. Then the voice of the nurse came to her and told her that killing was not allowed under any circumstances. When Arnie heard this, she looked at her in surprise. Nanny, smiling, also said that one should not hit people just because she didn't like them, and one should never use one's sword. She should smile broadly, speak softly, elegantly, and nobly. Arnie rolled her eyes when she heard all of this, not understanding who her nanny thought she was, since she knew all of the rules herself. People gradually began to gather around the manor in anticipation of the whole event. The girl was led to the place where the airship was to land. Her nanny told her to remember how they had been practicing with her all this time, and by no means to forget her manners, and to try to restrain herself. Arnie answered nothing to that. They went inside, and then she turned to Her Highness saying that they had already arrived. The airship was indeed already landed, and when the girl came closer and saw her old acquaintance, she was so surprised that she was even ready to scream. Cassian smiled and said that he was just expecting her and greeted the girl. The man bowed and, introducing himself, said that they had finally met again. He was very glad that it had not happened after too much time. Arnie continued to remain silent. She was so surprised that she could not say a word. She thought to herself that it was probably the Duke of Turnison who was supposed to go out with her. She tried to say one word, but nothing came out. She tried to say one word, but nothing came out. At least it was clear to her why he had been in the carriage, and she had thought him a common trickster. The girl didn't say another word. She left him alone in the midst of the crowd and simply turned around, starting to walk away. As she got closer to Nanny, she told her that she was going back and not going anywhere, and asked her to get on the airship. The nanny immediately ran after the lady, not understanding why she was acting like this, and wanted to catch up with her. But then Cassian's voice was suddenly heard, and he also addressed Arnie. The man came very close to her, and in a quiet voice told her in her ear that she owed him after all, so she could not leave. The girl looked at him with a murderous stare. She could barely contain her anger. Arnie was ready to kill him right there. But then suddenly the voice of a nurse was heard, who turned to the Duke telling him to be careful, for their princess was very weak. She kept screaming, and tears even came to the nanny's eyes. The woman told him to treat her like fragile glass, and to always take care of her. Arnie looked at her nanny in surprise, not understanding what she was even talking such nonsense, and more importantly, why. Some time had passed since then, and Arnie had to agree after all. So she moved into Cassian's manor. The girl hid from the maids in a tree so that they would not bother her, and the maids in turn looked for her, saying that she had been told not to walk, and did not understand where she had gone when the sun shone so brightly. Arnie herself was sitting in a tree and would not even show her nose. She didn't understand how she could have gotten to this point, and the maid kept yelling and saying that her beautiful and delicate skin would be ruined by this scorching sun. Cassian, who heard all those loud noises in the courtyard, immediately looked out the window and saw the girl sitting in a tree. She didn't notice him at all. The man began to smile, admiring her even more, and didn't understand how she was even able to climb that high on her own. He even got the feeling that he was not going to have a wife, but a real cat. Arnie felt someone's eyes on her at that moment. The girl immediately turned toward the manor, not realizing if she had been noticed. She looked out the window and felt as if someone was there. But when she saw that there was absolutely no one at the open window, she was very surprised. She felt that someone was watching her. The girl didn't pay much attention to it. She realized that first she had to get down to do something. With careful movements, she climbed down from the tree and hid behind its pillar. The maids kept running around the garden looking for the girl and still couldn't find her. She stood behind the tree for a while, hoping that the maids would leave soon. And it did happen. One of the maids said that maybe the girl was somewhere else, so they started to leave. When Arnie saw this, she smiled smugly, and exhaled a sigh of relief at the fact that no one had noticed her after all. But at that moment she was so caught up in her joy that she didn't even hear Cassian come up behind her and ask who she was hiding from. Arnie was ready to scream, but when she turned her head, she realized there was no threat. She wondered when he'd come to this place in the first place, and thought to herself that he was too inconspicuous, and she didn't know why. The man in turn smiled and said that he was just coming up, so no need to worry. The girl at that moment wondered whether he had seen her jump from the tree or not. She eyed him warily. Then Cassian smiled and asked if she liked him so much. The girl was surprised to hear that, and asked him why he thought that. The man continued to smile, saying that she was looking at him very intently, and she seemed to really like his face since she couldn't even take her eyes off it. Arnie felt a little uncomfortable, because she couldn't think of an excuse for staring at him for so long. Then she thought that he probably just liked to make fun of her and embarrass her. The man laughed, then inquired what her impression in general of her future spouse was, for he still didn't know. She thought about it for a while. Then she said that it wasn't really as bad as she thought it would be. When the man heard this, he asked her what she meant. Arnie thought at that moment that in principle he had no flaws. And remembering her sister's words, she thought she might ask him about his mistresses, to see if she was right. There was an awkward silence between them for a while. The man was the first to break it, asking with a smile on his face if she was thinking about someone else. When she heard that, she felt awkward and ashamed again. Her face even blushed. But Arnie wondered where he'd learned such an expression. After all, they weren't even married yet, and he couldn't talk to her in such a disrespectful way. However, Cassian was sly and said that they were about to get married, so it was okay. He reached out his hand to her and taking it, told her that it was too late for escape. After that, the man kissed her gently. In fact, the Duke's castle was a little busier than usual, and there was only one reason for that. The castle master's wedding day had finally arrived soon. Maids were preparing the halls, others were preparing the bride and groom, and Arnie's nanny was crying the whole time. She wiped away her tears and said that their girl was indeed getting married, and she would be incredibly anxious for the Duchess to see it. Arnie sighed heavily and said that she spoke as if she were dead. But Mama was still alive, and she shouldn't worry too much. Suddenly Rosalia's voice came from the magic ball that stood nearby. She told Nanny Ava that it was true. She was still doing very well at the manor and was not complaining about her health. But she also said she was sorry she wouldn't be able to attend her wedding in person, and she would have loved to. Arnie was very surprised that her mom would say such a thing. After all, she would be watching all the action through the magic ball anyway, so she wouldn't miss a single moment. Rosalia suddenly laughed and said that her father would also be watching this wedding, and her uncle had gone to the Northern Empire to attend in person from their family. When the girl heard all this, she was horrified. She didn't understand why they were doing all this. After all, she is going to get a divorce anyway, and then they create an extra work. After all, soon, when she will separate, she will have to call all these relatives and talk about this sad event. Some more time passed from that moment, and finally a veil was prepared for Arnie, which was attached to her beautiful, elegant hair. When the maid finished, she stepped away from her and told Mistress that everything was ready. The girl just looked at her reflection in the mirror for a while. It was really very beautiful and graceful. The maids were delighted and said that she was incredibly beautiful, and they had never seen such brides again. Arnie wasn't very happy about all this. She didn't understand why she was doing all this, for she didn't even want this wedding. She was beginning to wonder if she should marry without love. Then suddenly her mother spoke up and said that she had always been beautiful, but now she just shone like the most precious diamond in the world. Rosalia was ready to cry and congratulated the girl on having a new family. She said it would be an unforgettable experience. Parney, seeing how happy her mother was, thought of making her finally happy, so she decided not to do any tricks at this ceremony. Many Northern Empire guests had already gathered in the wedding hall. They were waiting for the ceremony to begin, and were already anticipating all this might. Cassian's assistant was standing nearby, unable to understand what was going on. It was all very disturbing to him. The man overheard a conversation between two ladies who couldn't wait to see which girl the Duke had chosen. One of them said that some say he had fallen in love with her at first sight. The aide rolled his eyes and didn't understand why, even because of such an incomprehensible situation, the Lord was organizing a wedding. The man didn't know what he was thinking or why he was doing all this. The guests present in the hall began to whisper. Everyone was discussing the Duke's bride-to-be and couldn't wait to see her. Then suddenly, the music started playing, and one of the butlers said that the bride and groom were beginning to come out. As the doors opened, a lovely castaway walked into the room. holding the hand of the even more lovely Arnie. They walked forward, and the guests were really very surprised. After all, they expected the girl to be beautiful, but they did not know that she was so beautiful. Arnie, for her part, didn't even smile. She walked and thought about whether she'd made the right choice, but then she realized that no matter how hard she tried, she'd have to do it sooner or later. Cassian, who was walking beside her, kept looking at the girl and smiling. The priest, who was already standing in the middle, began his speech and said that they were the bride and groom, thanking everyone present for attending this joyful and very exciting event. Arnie, who was already standing near the altar, suddenly became very anxious. She finally realized that she was really getting married. The priest spoke, addressing the bride first, and inquired if she vowed to love her spouse forever. The girl, when she heard the word forever, looked at him in surprise and could not believe that one could make such vows, for it was all staged and untrue. But she had nothing else to do. She waved her head and looked away, saying she swore. Then the priest turned to the bridegroom and asked if he would swear to love his spouse forever. The priest turned to the bridegroom and asked if he swore to love his wife forever. Then the minister said that, as a sign of eternal love, the bride and groom should kiss. Arnie was stunned when she heard this. She didn't expect it to be so formal and formal. The girl stared in surprise at the man who was coming closer and closer to her and didn't know what to do. And Cassian in turn put his hand on her chin and said in a quiet voice that if she wanted to leave everything, she should run right now. It would be her last chance. There was no turning back. But Arnie suddenly became very serious and looked him straight in the eye and said that he had said it was too late to run, so she didn't need his indulgence. The man, hearing these words, smiled and said that it was right. She says it's too late. After that, he grabbed her waist and started to pull her closer. And at the moment when the girl least expected it, their lips touched in a tender and passionate kiss right in front of everyone. And the guests who were so expecting this moment, even for a while, hushed. But when it all happened, they immediately began to cheerfully applaud the young couple. The bride and groom kissed for a while longer. Then he moved away from her, and they didn't say a word to each other. Arnie felt very uncomfortable and thought about the fact that after all this, she felt like she was going to suffocate. The priest, seeing that their actions were completed, said that in that case, he would pronounce them husband and wife. The girl still couldn't get away from that kiss and thought, looking at the man, that this marriage was doomed to failure from the very beginning. Either she would kill him, or Cassian wouldn't stand for it and would commit the crime. After this joyous and somewhat sad ceremony, a very lavish banquet was given at the castle of Ternozin. As soon as the official part of the party was over, the maid immediately picked up Arnie and began to lead her away to her bedroom, telling her that she needed to rest and she was in no way allowed to strain her legs any further. But in the end, Arnie could not even be at this lavish banquet because of the fact that the maids were overprotective and worried about her. But she is not a fragile and weak girl and can stand up for herself. The maids, for their part, thought that if she moved one more time, she would faint. In fact, when Arnie remembered the evening and the kiss, a slight blush always came to her cheeks. But she quickly pushed those thoughts away from her, not realizing what she was just thinking, because she needed to forget this as soon as possible. Soon the doors to the room opened and the maid said they had come just to her new room. When the girl went inside, she was very surprised, for this room was very expensive and spacious, and it was actually even much better than Arnie had even imagined. She walked over to the bed and sat down on it, thinking that now at least she would be able to rest properly. She also began to think about everything that had happened during the day. The maids, who were still standing around for a while, suddenly laughed and said that they would be on their way, and lastly wished her a good wedding night. When Arnie heard this, she didn't immediately realize what they even meant. But then she suddenly remembered this horrible event as the first wedding night. The girl started to get very worried and realized that she can't just sit still like this. She didn't want to become the one who killed her husband on their wedding night. She was going to escape and just saw a beautiful terrace, which will help her in this. Arnie immediately ran out and saw that if she could jump to where she wanted to go, she would make it and not have to go through all this embarrassment. But when she was about to do it, someone came up behind her and asked her what she was doing, because it was very high up there. Arnie was immediately surprised. for she had not expected anyone to come and see her. When she saw the stern look in her current husband's eyes, she immediately felt uncomfortable. The girl didn't think she would be caught doing it again, and it made her feel very embarrassed, but the man kept looking at her and asked what she was doing there. Arnie was still standing by the window, not sure what to say. She supposed she could just make him unconscious with one blow, or she could tell him the truth. Cassian grew sterner and said that he wanted to know what she was even doing there, since the girl never answered his question. She laughed nervously and said she just wanted some fresh air, so she opened the window and came even closer. She was too stuffy for that. The man peered over her back and wondered, was she really going to breathe fresh air at this hour, and had she climbed onto the windowsill? The girl was completely shoeless, and then suddenly realized that her excuse wasn't working, so she had to come up with something better. Cassian looked at her in surprise and asked, was she really going to kill herself? When Arnie heard this, it really surprised her, for she had never even thought of such a thing and didn't understand why he would even think of it. She immediately said she had no such thoughts, but she wondered if it was possible to die if you fell from such a height. Cassian apparently didn't believe her words and just said he understood, but the girl wasn't even going to convince him otherwise, because that would take too long. She wasn't going to do that. Also for the reason that she couldn't just tell her fiancé that she was trying to avoid her wedding night by jumping out the window. The man, in turn, came closer to her and held out his hand. The girl hesitated for a while, but then she took his hand and he helped her down from the window. When she was already standing with both feet in the room, her husband told her to take care of her body from now on. Arnie was a little surprised at this advice, but she said nothing. She didn't know what to do. Most of all, she didn't want to spend the night with a strange man she didn't even want to be near. The girl also thought about the fact that there would surely be a sensation about her leaving the first woman to kill her husband right after marriage. Cassian, for his part, looked at the girl and remembered the words of her nanny. Some had said that he should treat her like fragile glass and that she was very weak. He actually thought she was just fragile and needed to be careful, and she apparently had such a weak psyche that she even tried to kill herself right after the wedding. The man took her hand and led her away, closer to the bed, while Arnie thought about what she should do. She'd even considered actually knocking him out. Soon they stopped, and the man was able to lift her into his arms with one movement. The girl was very surprised when she saw this, for she realized that this was the beginning of the end of her. Arnie didn't understand how she could lie in the same bed with a man she had known for 2 days. The girl closed her eyes, not knowing what to do now, and she didn't understand how she had gotten into such a terrible situation. But at that moment, the man suddenly put her in bed and covered her with a blanket. When the girl opened her eyes, she was very surprised, because she had expected something completely different. Arnie didn't understand what kind of situation was going on. The man had told her, as he covered her, that she must be very tired so she should sleep. When the girl heard this, she couldn't believe that he was really suggesting that she just lie down and fall asleep, and she wasn't sure if it was okay to do that on the first wedding night. Cassian leaned closer to her, kissed her on the cheek, and told her not to think about anything and just rest, gaining strength for the new day. The man then left the room, slamming the door behind him, and thus Arnie was left alone with her thoughts. In fact, it worked out exactly as she wanted it to. But she didn't like the fact that he was treating her like a little child, as if she couldn't walk to bed or do anything else. For aristocrats, marriage is one of the most important tools. Sometimes it may simply be a transaction whose purpose is the welfare of the family. Such are the customs of marriage. That's why many people assume that Duke Turnisson's wedding was just such an occasion until they saw the bride and groom together. After this ceremony, guests began discussing how the Duke looked at his bride and the chemistry between them. On the first day of her marriage, the Duchess never showed up at the banquet due to the heavy tutelage of the Duke's maids. This strange situation alerted many guests, and they had many questions. The men could not understand how the Duchess could be absent from her own wedding banquet, and could not believe that the Duke cared so much for the welfare of his wife. One of the guests even said that there were rumors that he had kicked out all the men who looked at the Duchess with admiration. Another replied that it was true after all. The Duke had fallen in love with his future consort at first sight, since he would not even allow others to lay eyes on her. In fact, however, it was quite different. Arnie, terrified that the man might return at any moment, climbed a tree and slept there, hiding from her annoying maids. Cassian was in his study as he always was in the morning, his window overlooking just the tree where his current wife was sleeping, and he just stood there looking at her for a while. Behind him stood his assistant with a completely strange expression on his face. The man didn't understand what he was even doing, and couldn't believe that the gentleman had actually fallen in love with this girl. After some time of silence, the gentleman turned to his assistant Helene and said he wanted to know something. The man immediately snapped out of his thoughts and inquired what he wanted to ask the man. Cassian then asked, with a completely serious expression on his face, what he thought his wife's attempted suicide on her wedding night meant. Then the assistant heard this and was very surprised. He said he didn't know exactly, but he thought it meant that she didn't like the marriage to death. The man sighed heavily and said that it was the only normal option after all. They were silent for a while, and then Helene said that yesterday the second prince had asked for a special invitation. He handed him the envelopes, and Cassian asked in surprise if Mackenzia had really handed it over, and immediately left. The aide bowed and said that it was just like that. After that, Helene also inquired when he was even planning to make a visit to the emperor. The gentleman did not listen to him. He opened the letter and began to read it carefully. After the man familiarized himself with its contents, he put the letter aside and said that he would visit the emperor very soon. From that moment, some more time passed, and Arnie had to get down from the tree after all. She was sitting at a small table in the garden, with her nanny standing beside her, and her mother communicating with her through a magic ball. Rosalia looked admiringly at her daughter and asked if she had enjoyed this wonderful time. When the girl heard this phrase from her mother, she choked on her tea. The babysitter saw this and immediately ran over to her and asked if she was all right. Arnie replied that she was fine, but she was actually thinking about how she could break the magic ball so her mother wouldn't ask any more stupid questions. Rosalia then decided to change the subject and said that some people were talking about her subordinates causing a commotion. The Golden Dragon Guild went on strike, demanding her return. The emperor asked to be told to tell her to stop them and educate them. Also said she wouldn't be back anytime soon. Arnie, on the other hand, was very surprised when she heard about the strike. Her mother said that some of them had lost all contact. His Majesty is very upset, for they were the best warriors to defend their lands. Rosalia was silent for a while. After that, she said that she also did not always answer. She said that if she could not be reached, she could call Uncle Sarno. But her mother was indignant and said that some people were talking about her not even accepting visits from the Duke of Sarno. The girl rolled her eyes and thought that she was actually just a little busy, but of course she couldn't tell the emperor to his face that she didn't want to see him. After that, the army thought about the fact that all the soldiers went on strike, all because she had gone on marriage. But then suddenly the girl was interrupted from her musings by a maid, who ran up to her and said that the Duke had sent gifts for her. Arnie immediately turned in her direction and saw that the butler had brought a whole cart full of different colored boxes of varying sizes. Her mother, who was in touch, said it was very romantic. Apparently he really loves Arnie a lot. The girl was very wary. She didn't know what the gifts were for. She really hoped it wasn't because she was allegedly trying to commit suicide. But at that moment she suddenly heard some rustling in the bushes. The girl was alert, but saw nothing. But when the girl looked more closely, she felt some sense of presence. Then she saw the silhouette of a man behind the bushes. He was a young man with bright red hair. Arnie recognized him immediately, but she couldn't figure out what he was doing in this place or how he'd gotten here. This guy's name was Crave, and she didn't know what he was doing in the northern continent because he was supposed to be out west right now. She hadn't invited anyone over on purpose, so it wouldn't get out that she was a member of the guild, and she didn't understand why he'd come. The girl turned away thinking she must have imagined it. But when she turned again, she saw that Crave sitting in the bushes was waving to her in greeting. Arnie sighed heavily and realized she hadn't imagined it after all. She turned away quickly, pretending not to notice him, and realized that she had to get him out of the place before anyone noticed. While the maid stepped aside with the nanny, talking about the gifts, the girl began to pour herself some tea and whispered to the boy what he was doing in this place, and asked him to leave immediately. But Crave laughed and said, smiling, that he wasn't going to leave because he didn't want to. When Arnie heard that, she was furious. She didn't understand how he could answer her like that. So she decided that if he wasn't going to leave, she would just send him away. The girl rose from her seat and glared angrily at him, but she could not move a step forward, for she felt some strange aura behind her. She didn't know who it could be, but as she stepped forward, she felt something wrong with her dress. She had accidentally caught the bottom of it with her shoe. Arnie felt that she could not stand any longer and began to fall, but she did not land on the ground, but fell into the soft and manly arms of her husband, Cassian. He managed to react in time and caught the girl and asked if she was all right.